Jake Morrison fought for 8 years in Afghanistan. He faced gunfire and bombs, endured the searing desert heat, and survived long nights in the trenches. But nothing had prepared him for the heartbreaking scene he was about to witness. At dawn in Asheville, before the darkness had fully lifted, he stood trembling behind the fence of his ex-wife's house. Martha's whispered words still echoed in his ears. "Your son is in the shed next to the pig pen." Those words were like salt rubbed into Jake's heart. His son, the child he had loved with all his being, had to live in a place like that? The stench from the pig pen hit him head-on, making Jake choke. Then he heard it, a small, broken sob, like the cry of an injured fledgling calling for help. The wooden shed came into view, leaning as if it might collapse at any moment. 8 years. 8 years of longing to see his son again, but not like this. Never like this. Ethan, his son, was curled up in the corner of the shed. The boy was so thin Jake could count each rib through the paper-thin shirt. His hair was matted, his face ashen, his eyes swollen. "Ethan!" Jake's voice caught in his throat. The boy startled, his frightened eyes fixed on the stranger standing in the doorway. Jake saw it, the fear, the instinctive flinch of a child who had grown far too accustomed to storms. Jake knelt slowly, his hands trembling as he pulled an old photograph from his pocket. The photo was creased and worn, its edges faded, but it still clearly showed a father and son smiling brightly. Jake at 27, Ethan at 2, sitting on his father's shoulders. "Ethan, it's Daddy," Jake whispered, tears spilling freely. Ethan squinted at the photograph. His eyes moved from the picture to the bearded, scarred, older man standing before him. In that moment of silence, the whole world seemed to stop. "Daddy?" Ethan's voice was barely a trembling whisper. Then, like a dam breaking, Ethan threw himself into Jake's arms, clinging tightly to the soldier's neck. He cried not soft sobs, but the choking release of 8 years of missing, 8 years of waiting, 8 years of fragile hope. "I thought you left me. I thought you weren't coming back." Jake held his son close, feeling the small body shudder. This was not the chubby 2-year-old he had left behind. This was a child who had lived through far too much darkness. 8 years earlier, Asheville had still known golden afternoons. 27-year-old Jake sat on the porch of their small wooden house, his calloused carpenter's hands gently pushing the swing for Ethan. The laughter of the 2-year-old rang out like silver bells. "Daddy, higher, go higher!" Rebecca stood in the doorway, beautiful in her floral dress, yet her eyes were clouded. "Jake, we can't go on like this forever. Where's next month's rent coming from?" Jake knew she was right. Carpentry wasn't enough. They needed something more. And then the letter arrived, the notice of military enlistment. On the morning he left, Rebecca cried into his shoulder. "You have to come back, Jake. Promise me." Jake hugged Ethan tightly and kissed his son's forehead. "I'll come back, buddy. I'll take you fishing, take you to baseball games. I promise." At 2 years old, Ethan didn't understand what was happening. He only held onto his father's finger, refusing to let go. 6 years earlier, the Afghan desert burned like fire. Jake sat in a military tent, his hands shaking as he held the court document. Divorce papers, cold lines of text declaring the end of his marriage. Rebecca's letter enclosed with it read, "I can't wait forever. I need a man who's here, who can take care of me and Ethan. I'm sorry." Jake called home. The number no longer existed. He wrote to his son. No one replied. The letters came back marked, "Undeliverable." Tom Bradley, his fellow soldier, placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "You'll see your boy again when you get home. Stay strong, brother." Jake slipped Ethan's photo into the pocket of his body armor, right over his heart. For 6 long years, through every mission, every battle, that fragile hope burned inside him. My son is still waiting for me, back in the present, inside the dark shed. Jake gently eased Ethan back, his rough hands trembling as he checked his son's body. "Uncle Derek, he's always angry at me," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "Mom doesn't protect me, Dad. She says I have to behave." Jake clenched his jaw, forcing down the rage boiling in his chest. He gripped his son's hand, the small, icy fingers. "I'm taking you out of here, I promise. You won't leave me again, will you?" Ethan looked up at him, his eyes filled with fear. "Never," Jake promised, his voice firm as steel. "I fought far away to protect my country. Now I'll fight anyone to protect my son." Then a scream tore through the dawn. "Someone's in the backyard." Rebecca's voice rang out from inside the house, shrill like an alarm siren. The back door flew open. Derek Caldwell burst out, a burly 40-year-old man, his face flushed red with rage. "Who the hell are you? You dare trespass on my property?" Jake rose from the shed, Ethan hiding behind him. The soldier faced Derek, his voice calm as a lake before a storm. "My name is Jake Morrison, Ethan's biological father." Rebecca ran out after her husband, her face draining of color when she saw Jake, 8 years apart. Yet she recognized him instantly, the man she once loved, now aged and marked by the scars of war. "Jake, what are you doing with Ethan?" "I'm taking my son out of this place," Jake said, his voice cold as ice. He spread his arms protectively in front of Ethan. Derek stepped forward, puffing himself up as if to intimidate Jake. "Some soldier playing hero, huh? You've got no rights here. That kid belongs to my wife." "This boy is my son," Jake shot back, each word like a bullet. "And I've seen what's been going on here." Jake's gaze locked onto Derek, then dropped to the bruises on Ethan's arm. Derek pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. "There's a strange man trespassing on my property, trying to take my wife's kid." 15 minutes later, a police car pulled up in front of the house. Officer James Cooper stepped out, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. He was a former Marine who had served in Iraq. When he noticed the old jacket Jake was wearing, bearing an infantry division insignia, Cooper gave a slight nod. "What's going on here?" Derek jumped in immediately. "Officer, this guy broke onto my property and is trying to take my wife's son." Cooper looked at Jake, then down at Ethan, who was trembling and clinging tightly to his father. The boy was thin, pale, his eyes filled with fear. "Mr. Caldwell," Cooper said, turning to Derek, his tone firm, "I need you to explain the marks on the child." Derek raised his voice. "He falls all the time. Kids do that, running around, getting into things. My wife and I take very good care of him." Rebecca stood behind her husband, stammering. "Yes, that's right. Kids are always getting into trouble." Ethan shook his head slightly and clutched Jake even tighter. He said nothing, but the gesture said everything. Cooper looked Jake in the eye. "Who are you to the child?" "I'm Jake Morrison, Ethan's biological father. I have his birth certificate and my military records to prove it." At that moment, the back door opened again. Vanessa Caldwell, 8 years old, appeared in a pretty pink dress, her hair neatly tied with a bow. She looked at Ethan with a puzzled expression, then turned to her father. "Daddy, why is Ethan outside? I don't want him coming into the house." Derek patted his daughter's head. "It's okay, sweetheart. Daddy will take care of it." In that instant, the contrast was as stark as a black and white photograph. Vanessa loved, cared for, shining like a princess. Ethan pushed aside, treated as if he didn't belong. Cooper sighed and turned to Jake. "Mr. Morrison, do you have legal custody of the child?" "I'm his biological father. I have all the proper documents." Cooper nodded and held out his hand. "Let me see them." Jake pulled out the worn birth certificate, his military ID, and the photograph of father and son. Cooper examined them carefully, then looked down at Ethan, still trembling. "All right, I'm taking Ethan for a medical evaluation, and I'll be filing a report with social services. For now, he'll remain with Mr. Morrison." Derek stepped forward, growling. "You'll regret this, you crippled soldier. You think you can beat me?" Jake didn't reply. He simply turned away and led Ethan off. Rebecca stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. But she did nothing, didn't run after her son, didn't plead. She just stood there, like a shattered stone statue. Jake's old car rolled along streets that were familiar yet felt distant. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window in silence. Jake glanced over at him from time to time, his heart tightening at the sight of that small, fragile figure. Frank Morrison's trailer sat on the edge of town, among rows of old oak trees. When the car stopped, the trailer door swung open. Frank, 62 years old, his hair completely gray, stepped out, his eyes fixed on the grandson he hadn't seen in 8 years. "Ethan." Frank's voice trembled. The boy got out of the car and looked at the elderly man standing before him. Frank knelt down and opened his arms. "You've grown so much. Grandpa's missed you so much." Ethan hesitated for a moment, then stepped into his grandfather's embrace. Frank held him tightly, tears running down his weathered face. The two Morrison men, father and son, stood quietly, letting 8 years of emotion flow freely. Inside the trailer, though cramped, everything was neat and orderly. On the walls hung framed photographs. Jake in uniform, Ethan at 2 years old with a bright smile, and a neatly folded American flag, a keepsake from a fellow soldier's military funeral. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, looking around. His gaze stopped on the photo of himself at 2. That's me? Yes, Frank said softly. I've kept that picture for 8 years. Every night I looked at it and prayed you were safe. Jake placed a hand on his son's shoulder. You'll stay here, with Dad and Grandpa. You're safe. Ethan nodded, but fear still lingered in his eyes, the fear that this was all just a dream, that come morning he would wake up back in that dark shed. Frank looked at his son, then at his grandson. Joy flooded his heart, but worry crept in as well. They were poor. They had no lawyer. How could they fight Rebecca and Derek, people with money and influence? But when he looked into Jake's eyes filled with a soldier's resolve, Frank knew this battle was not over. It had only just begun, and the Morrison family would fight until their very last breath. The Asheville Community Clinic was filled with morning sunlight, but Jake felt as if he was sitting in the dark. Ethan lay on the examination table, his small body curled up inside an oversized hospital gown. Dr. Robert Hayes, a gray-haired physician with kind eyes, carefully examined each bruise on the boy's body. He took meticulous notes, occasionally letting out a heavy sigh. 20 kilograms, Dr. Hayes said gravely. At 10 years old, he should weigh at least 32 kilograms. Jake sat in his chair, his hands clenched tightly together. Every number, every sign, cut into him like a knife. Dr. Hayes turned to Jake. Mr. Morrison, this child has been through a very difficult time. Severe malnutrition, anemia, and... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Clear indications that he has not received proper care for a long period of time. Jake stood up, walked to the bed, and took Ethan's small hand in his own. Never again, he vowed quietly. I promise you. Ethan looked up at his father, his eyes shimmering with fragile trust. The Veterans Legal Aid office was housed in an old building in the center of town. Jake stepped inside, his worn military backpack slung over his shoulder, a thick folder of Ethan's medical records in his hand. The reception area was small, lit by warm yellow light. A tall woman with neatly tied brown hair rose from behind the desk. Grace Parker, 42 years old, with a gaze that was decisive yet warm, like a winter fire. Mr. Morrison? Grace extended her hand. I'm Grace Parker. Jake shook her hand, feeling strength and sincerity in her grip. Grace ushered Jake into a private office and listened as he told the entire story, from the moment he found Ethan in the shed, to the confrontation with Derek, to the heartbreaking medical report. She reviewed each page, her expression growing more serious. Mr. Morrison, Grace said firmly, I'll take this case pro bono. No child deserves to go through what Ethan has endured. For the first time in days, Jake felt a glimmer of light. I don't know how to thank you. No need to thank me, Grace said, opening her laptop. We have work to do. Grace laid out the strategy, her voice clear and methodical. We need to prove 3 things. 1. Ethan was not properly cared for. 2. You are a capable parent. 3. Ethan's best interests are served by being with you. Jake lowered his head. But I'm poor. I live in a trailer. I have issues from the war. Grace looked him straight in the eye. But you have love, and that is the most important thing a child needs. Her words melted the ice that had long weighed on Jake's heart. Over the next 3 days, Grace and Jake went all over town gathering witnesses. Mrs. Martha Sullivan, the elderly neighbor, sat in her small living room, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea. I saw Ethan many times. He was often sent outside, not allowed in the house. I secretly brought him food, bandaged his wounds. Mrs. Dorothy White, Ethan's teacher, opened her attendance book. He missed 47 days of school last year. When he did come, he was always frightened and afraid to speak to other children. Coach Mike Turner, the baseball coach, shook his head. I invited Ethan to join the team. The boy has talent, but his mother refused, said she couldn't afford the equipment. Yet I saw her buying expensive toys for her new husband's daughter. Each testimony was another piece of the puzzle, slowly revealing a heartbreaking picture. But Rebecca and Derek did not sit idly by. A thick envelope arrived at Grace's office. Inside was a countersuit filed by attorney Richard Stone, a well-known lawyer with a reputation for being ruthless and unethical. Jake Morrison is a mentally unstable veteran, Grace read aloud, her voice tight with anger. Impoverished, dangerous, and unfit to care for a child. Attached were photographs, Frank's rundown trailer, Jake's PTSD medical records, and Rebecca's sworn statement. I am a good mother. Jake abandoned the family for 8 years. Ethan no longer remembers his father. Jake finished reading, his fists clenched white. Grace placed a hand on his shoulder. They're trying to provoke you, to make you lose control and make a mistake. Don't let them win. But that night, when Jake's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, you don't stand a chance. I know the judge. The kid will be coming back to my house. He nearly lost control. Frank and Tom Bradley, Jake's former comrade in arms, had to hold him back. You'll destroy yourself if you do this, Tom said. You have to stay calm for Ethan. Late that night, Jake sat beside Ethan's bed. The boy tossed in his sleep, whimpering softly. Jake stroked his hair and quietly sang the lullaby he used to sing 8 years earlier. Ethan woke up, his eyes red. Daddy, I'm scared. I know, son. Jake pulled him close. I have nightmares too. Nights far from home, I dreamed of terrible things, but I learned how to fight them. You won't make me go back to Uncle Derek, will you? Ethan's voice trembled. Jake looked straight into his son's eyes. Never. I'll fight with everything I have to keep you with me. Ethan was silent for a moment, then whispered, I trust you. Those 3 words, I trust you, carried more weight than any medal Jake had ever received. The Saturday afternoon sun streamed into the small Baptist church in downtown Asheville. Pastor Henry Williams, a gray-haired man with a warm, steady voice, stood at the pulpit, looking toward Jake and Ethan, seated in the front pew. Today we pray for the Morrison family, Pastor Henry said, for a soldier who has come home, and for a child who is learning to trust again. The church fell silent. Then, one by one, people stood. Jake looked around, his eyes burning with tears. Bill Thompson, the owner of the local hardware store, stepped forward and placed an envelope on the table. You can work part-time for me. It's not much, but it's enough to get by. Martha Sullivan carried in 2 large bags of clothes. They belong to my grandson. He's grown out of them. Ethan can wear these. Sam Rodriguez, an old friend and fellow carpenter, clapped Jake on the shoulder. Your trailer needs fixing up. I'll build a separate room for the boy. No charge. Jake stood, his voice breaking. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Pastor Henry said with a smile. We're family. We take care of one another. For the first time in many years, Jake felt he was no longer alone. He didn't have to fight by himself anymore. The days that followed felt like small miracles. Martha took Ethan into the backyard, her wrinkled hands holding a small shovel. You see, planting roses takes patience. You have to tend to them every day, water them, pull the weeds, and one day they'll bloom. Ethan knelt down and gently placed the rose bush into the soil. Is it like being patient while waiting for Dad to come home, Grandma? Martha stroked his hair. That's right, sweetheart, and now your dad is home. Grace came by one afternoon, carrying a new box of colored pencils and a thick sketchbook. I hear you like to draw. Ethan's eyes lit up. Yes, ma'am, I really do. Then why don't you draw your new family for me? Ethan sat at the table, pencil in hand, drawing carefully, line by line. In the picture were Dad Jake standing tall, Grandpa Frank beside him, Grandma Martha with her gentle smile, Miss Grace with her neatly tied hair, and Uncle Sam holding a hammer. They all stood around Ethan, holding hands. Grace looked at the drawing, her eyes misting over. It's beautiful. That Saturday afternoon, Frank took Ethan to a small lake outside town. Grandfather and grandson sat by the water, old fishing rods in their hands. I taught your dad how to fish when he was little, Frank said. He used to complain the fish never bit. I told him, you have to be patient. Life doesn't always move fast. Ethan stared quietly at the shimmering water. Grandpa, can I stay with Dad and you forever? Frank put an arm around him. I'll do everything I can to make that happen, son. Suddenly, Ethan's fishing rod jerked. He shouted and pulled hard. A small fish broke the surface. Frank helped him reel it in, and they both burst out laughing. That laughter, clear and joyful, was something Ethan had forgotten for a long time, but now it had returned, like sunshine after the rain. Meanwhile, Grace continued digging deeper. She sat in her office, her computer screen filled with troubling figures. Jake, did you know Rebecca receives $800 a month in child support? Because you're a veteran, the money is sent directly to the legal guardian. Jake frowned. I had no idea. And there's a trust fund set up for Ethan, Grace continued, her voice tight with anger. But none of that money was ever spent on him. Rebecca and Derek used it for luxury vacations and expensive clothes for Vanessa. Ethan has no savings account, no individual health insurance. Jake clenched his fists. They exploited my son. This isn't just neglect, Grace said firmly. This is fraud. We have a very strong legal case. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychologist with perceptive, understanding eyes, sat across from Jake and Ethan in the therapy room. Mr. Morrison, she said gently, you need to learn how to manage your emotions. When you feel overwhelmed, take deep breaths and count to 10. Jake nodded, listening closely. She turned to Ethan. And you, when you go to court, you'll meet the judge. She'll ask you a few questions. You just need to tell the truth. Ethan trembled. But I'm scared. Jake knelt down and took his son's hand. You don't need to be afraid. I'll be right there beside you. Just say what you feel. The night before the hearing, Jake couldn't sleep. He sat on the trailer's porch, staring up at a sky full of stars. His breath formed white clouds in the cold air. A car pulled up. Grace stepped out, holding 2 cups of coffee. I figured you wouldn't be sleeping. Jake took the cup and gave a tired smile. That obvious, huh? Grace sat down beside him. Are you afraid? Jake was silent for a moment, then sighed. I've faced a lot of frightening things, but I've never been this scared. I'm afraid of losing my son. You're a good father, Jake, Grace said warmly. Ethan sees that, and the judge will too. Jake looked at her. For the first time since his divorce, he felt a connection with a woman, not rushed romance, but trust and deep understanding. Thank you, Jake said quietly. Thank you for believing in me. Grace smiled. I don't just believe in you. I believe in what's right. Near midnight, Jake stepped into Ethan's room. The boy was asleep, clutching a worn stuffed bear, the only gift left from the time when his parents were still together. Jake sat beside the bed and gently stroked his son's hair. Moonlight streamed through the window, casting soft patterns across Ethan's small face. I promise I'll protect you, Jake whispered, no matter what it costs. You're the reason I came home. You're the reason I'll never give up. Ethan smiled in his sleep, as if he had heard his father's promise. Jake stayed there until morning, watching over his son's peaceful rest. Tomorrow, the greatest battle would begin. But tonight, in this quiet moment, Jake knew he had already gained what mattered most, his son's trust and the unconditional love of a father. Dawn was approaching, and with it came the hope of a new beginning. The Asheville County Courthouse stood tall, like a wall of justice. Judge Margaret Anderson, 58 years old, her silver hair neatly pinned back, her eyes sharp yet compassionate, entered the courtroom. She was the daughter of a veteran and understood all too well the pain carried by soldiers who return home. On the left side, Rebecca sat beside Derek and attorney Richard Stone. She wore an elegant suit, her hair carefully styled, her expression anxious but composed. Derek, dressed in a black suit, sat rigid, his face tight with tension. On the right, Jake sat next to Frank and Grace. Jake's old suit had been carefully pressed, his shoes polished with care. Dignity did not come from money, but from sincerity. Ethan sat in the waiting area with a social worker, his eyes fixed on his father with fragile trust. Attorney Stone rose, his voice confident, like that of a man certain of victory. Your Honor, Jake Morrison abandoned his family for 8 years. He suffers from psychological trauma from the war, lives in poverty, and resides in an environment unfit for raising a child. Stone presented photographs, Frank's worn-down trailer, Jake's PTSD medical records, proof of low income. This is no place to raise a child. He then called Karen Mitchell, Rebecca's friend, to testify. I've seen Rebecca take very good care of Ethan. He always seemed happy and well. Jake clenched his hands, struggling to restrain himself. Grace placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering, "Stay calm." Grace stood, her gaze sharp as a blade. Your Honor, I would like to call Dr. Robert Hayes. The doctor stepped forward and opened the medical file. Ethan Morrison weighs 20 kilograms, far below the normal range. He shows signs of severe malnutrition, along with multiple old and recent bruises. Grace presented the medical photographs. Judge Anderson studied them, her expression growing grave finger-shaped bruises, the marks of storms no child should ever endure. This child has not received proper care for a long period of time, Dr. Hayes concluded. Next came Martha Sullivan. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I saw Ethan forced outside, sleeping in a shed next to a pig pen. I secretly brought him food and bandaged his wounds. There were times when it rained, and he was still made to stay outside. Mrs. Dorothy White, the teacher, presented school records. Ethan missed 47 days of school. When he did attend, he was frightened and often had no lunch. Officer Cooper described finding Ethan in the shed and the boy's distressing condition. Derek jumped to his feet, his voice raised. "They're all lying. Blind old fools." Judge Anderson struck the gavel. "Mr. Caldwell, control yourself." Then came the most critical moment. Ethan was escorted into a private room with only Judge Anderson, the attorneys, and Jake watching through a video screen. Judge Anderson smiled gently. "You don't need to be afraid. I just want to hear your story." Ethan sat down, his small hands clenched tightly. I had to sleep in the shed," Uncle Derek said. "I smelled. Mom wouldn't let me eat at the table. I only got leftovers." Tears began to roll down Ethan's cheeks, not loud sobbing, but the quiet tears of longing. "Uncle Derek, he doesn't like me. When Vanessa cried, he said it was my fault. I missed my dad. I drew pictures of him every day, but Mom threw them all away." Judge Anderson listened, her eyes filled with tears. Ethan looked into the camera, straight into Jake's eyes in the next room. "I love my dad. I want to live with him." Jake could no longer hold back. Tears streamed down the hardened soldier's face. Frank wrapped an arm around his son. They sat in silence, overwhelmed by pain and pride. Judge Anderson turned to Derek. "Do you have anything to say regarding Ethan's testimony?" Derek stood, his face flushed red. "That kid is lying. I fed him and gave him a place to stay, and he dares complain." Stone tried to pull him back down, but Derek shoved the attorney's hand away. "He's not my kid. Why should I have to put up with him?" Silence fell. The entire courtroom froze. Derek had just exposed his true nature. Stone closed his eyes, knowing it was over. Grace stood and presented the financial records. Rebecca Morrison received $800 a month in child support. None of that money was ever used for Ethan. He had no health insurance, no adequate clothing. The funds were spent on luxury vacations and expensive clothes for Vanessa. Judge Anderson turned to Jake. "Mr. Morrison, would you like to speak?" Jake stood, his voice trembling but steady. "Your Honor, I am poor. I live in a trailer. I carry wounds from the war. But I love my son more than anything in this world. I fought for my country. Now I ask to fight for my child. I cannot give him a wealthy life, but I can give him love, safety, and a home without darkness." The courtroom was silent. Many wiped away tears. Judge Anderson recessed for 30 minutes. When she returned, she looked directly at Rebecca and Derek. "The court has reviewed all the evidence," she said firmly. "I see a child who was neglected and unloved. I see fraud and a failure of responsibility. Mrs. Morrison and Mr. Caldwell failed to protect this child. As for Mr. Morrison, despite difficult circumstances, he has demonstrated love and determination." She struck the gavel. "The court awards full legal custody of Ethan Morrison to his biological father, Mr. Jake Morrison. Rebecca Morrison's parental rights are revoked. She is granted supervised visitation for 2 hours per month." Jake collapsed back into his chair, covering his face. Frank wrapped his arms around his son. Grace smiled, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. Ethan ran in and threw his arms around his father. "We won, didn't we, Dad?" Jake held him close and whispered, "Yes, son, you and me. We won." Derek growled and tried to move toward Jake, but court officers restrained him. Rebecca sank into her chair, sobbing. Stone gathered his files and left. Justice had been served, and for the first time in 8 years, the Morrison family was truly whole. The courtroom victory should have marked the beginning of happiness. But Jake soon realized that winning was only the first step on a long road to healing. In the first week, Ethan officially moved into the trailer. The small room Uncle Sam had fixed up now had a new bed, a dresser, and a drawing table. But every night, soft cries echoed from the boy's room. "No, Uncle Derek, don't." Ethan's voice trembled in his sleep. Jake rushed in and pulled his son into his arms. "You're safe now. I'm here." But Ethan kept shaking, his eyes wide as he scanned the room as if searching for an escape. Whenever an unfamiliar man came close, an electrician, a delivery worker, the boy would retreat, hiding behind Jake. After one appointment, Dr. Sarah Mitchell asked Jake to stay behind. "Mr. Morrison, Ethan is carrying deep emotional wounds. He needs time and patience." Jake lowered his head, his hands clenched. "It's all because I wasn't there when he needed me. I let him go through all of this. "You can't change the past, Doctor," Mitchell said gently, "but you can help create a different future for him." But the nightmares didn't belong to Ethan alone. Jake woke at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat. In his dream, he was back in Afghanistan, the echoes, the flashes of fire. He saw his comrades fall, and then the image shifted to Ethan crying out for help while he stood frozen, unable to reach him. Frank found his son curled up on the porch, shaking. He wrapped his arms around Jake. "You have to heal too, Jake. You can't help Ethan if you don't help yourself." "But I'm stronger than this, Dad," Jake whispered. "I survived the war." "Yes," Frank said, "but now you're fighting a different battle, a battle with yourself. And you don't have to fight it alone." News about Derek spread like a cold winter wind. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison for child abuse and financial fraud. One afternoon, Jake went to retrieve his car from the courthouse parking lot. Derek was standing there, waiting. His face was twisted with hatred. "You think you won?" Derek snarled. "I'll be out in 3 years. I'll find that kid, and I'll make you regret this." Jake stood still, forcing down the rage boiling inside him. "You will never go near my son again, if you even try," Derek sneered. "Or what? What are you gonna do?" Jake met his gaze without flinching. "I learned how to live with fear on the battlefield, but I also learned how to protect what I love. Don't test me." The police arrived and took Derek away, but the threat echoed in Jake's mind like a warning bell. One drizzly afternoon, Rebecca came to the trailer. She looked thinner, her eyes swollen, her hair no longer carefully kept as before. "Jake, can I see Ethan?" Jake stood in the doorway, not inviting her in. "By court order, you're allowed 2 hours a month. Supervised." Rebecca broke down in tears. "I'm sorry. I didn't know Derek would. I never thought it would go this far." Jake looked at the woman who had once been his wife. There was no anger left, no love, only emptiness. "You stood by and let your child suffer, Rebecca," he said quietly. "You're his mother. You should have protected him." Rebecca couldn't respond. She turned away, crying. The first supervised visit between Ethan and his mother took place in Grace's office. Rebecca brought expensive gifts, new toys, new clothes. Ethan sat across from her, his expression distant, nothing like that of a 10-year-old. "I don't need these things. I just needed you to protect me." Rebecca tried to hug him, but Ethan stepped back. "You didn't protect me when Uncle Derek hurt me. Why are you crying now?" Grace watched the scene, her heart aching. A child forced to grow up too soon, who had lost trust in the person who should have loved him most. Rebecca left in silence. Ethan didn't look back. The bills piled up like a mountain. $3,500 for medical treatment, $1,200 in court costs. Jake stared at the numbers, his head spinning. He sold his old pickup truck, his only means of transportation, to pay off the debt. Frank contributed his small savings. The church organized donations, but Jake felt his pride taking a blow. "I don't want to live on charity forever," he said to Frank. "That's not charity, son," Frank replied. "That's love." Jake worked 12-hour days at the hardware store, coming home exhausted. But every time he looked at Ethan, he knew he had to keep going. One night, Ethan sat beside his father, staring at the bills on the table. "Dad, am I making you poor?" Jake turned and held him tightly. "Never. You're my treasure. Nothing is more valuable than you." But deep down, Jake wondered, am I enough? Can I really give him the life he deserves? That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Jake sat on the porch, gazing at the star-filled sky. The courtroom victory had only been the beginning. The road to healing was still long. But no matter how hard it became, Jake knew he would not give up. For his son, for his family, for the love he had fought to protect. 2 months after the court ruling, darkness began to close in around Jake like a starless night. He worked from morning until night, coming home only to sleep. No more fishing trips with Ethan. No more evenings telling stories. Frank watched his son with growing concern. "You're destroying yourself, Jake." One night, the nightmares returned more violently than ever. Jake jolted awake, drenched in sweat. In his panic, he accidentally shoved Ethan, who was sleeping beside him. The boy fell to the floor, crying softly. Jake snapped fully awake and looked at his son, terror flooding his chest. Are you okay, Dad? Dad didn't mean to." Ethan nodded, but there was fear in his eyes, fear Jake had never seen before, fear of his own father. The next morning, Jake called Grace, his voice desperate. "Maybe I'm not a good father for Ethan. Maybe he'd be better off with another family, someone who doesn't carry scars from the war. Grace came immediately, her sharp eyes locking onto Jake. "Jake Morrison, listen to me," she said, her voice firm but filled with care. "You fought for your son. You won. And now you're ready to give up because of a dream? You are not the one hurting your child. You're a man carrying wounds from protecting his country. Ethan needs you, not a perfect father, but his father, the one who loves him more than anything." Her words cut through the darkness like a beam of light. Jake bowed his head, tears falling freely. Ethan wasn't doing well either. He stopped eating. He stopped drawing. Dr. Sarah Mitchell called Jake in, her tone worried. "Ethan is blaming himself. He thinks he's the reason you're struggling." That evening, Jake sat beside Ethan and took his hand. "Son, I'm sorry. I scared you." Ethan looked at him, tears rolling down his cheeks. "I'm not mad at you. I'm just scared. Scared you'll leave me like Mum did." Jake pulled him into his arms. "I will never leave you, but I need to heal, and I need your help. We're going to heal together." They began attending a father-son therapy group run by Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Tom Bradley, Jake's former squadmate, and his son were there too. In that small room, fathers and children shared their pain. Jake learned to talk about the war without hiding, without shame. Ethan learned to talk about fear without swallowing it, without blaming himself. "When I feel overwhelmed, I'll tell you," Jake promised. "I won't let the nightmares control me anymore. And when I'm scared, I'll tell you too," Ethan replied. It was the first step, small but vital, but danger returned. Derek was released early after 6 months. One night, late and dark, shouting erupted outside the trailer. "Bring the kid out here. I'll teach him a lesson." Jake ran outside and stood in front of the door. Derek was in the yard, drunk, his face flushed red. Frank had already called the police, but Derek fled before they arrived. Grace obtained a restraining order, but Jake knew the truth. The threat was still there, lurking in the shadows. At school, Ethan faced another trial. Vanessa and her friends bullied him. "Your dad ruined my dad's life." One afternoon, Ethan came home with a faint bruise under his eye. Jake jumped to his feet, furious. But Mrs. Dorothy White, the teacher, had already intervened. She suspended the bullies and transferred Vanessa to another class. "You were very brave," she told Ethan. "Don't let anyone take away your belief in yourself." The following evening at sunset, Jake and Ethan sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the oak trees. The sky burned orange and red, like one of Ethan's drawings. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" Ethan asked softly. Jake rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "We'll fight every day, son. There will be hard days. There will be dark nights. But we'll get through them together. And one day," Jake continued, looking into Ethan's eyes, "we'll be okay. Not perfect, but happy." Ethan leaned his head against his father's shoulder. "I trust you." Those 3 words once again carried more weight than any glory, because this was trust given after pain, after fear, after countless trials. The sun set, darkness fell. But within that darkness, 2 small lights, father and son, shone for each other, and that was enough to keep going. 6 months passed like the slow turning of book pages. Each day was a small step forward on the road to healing. Jake enrolled in a vocational training program for veterans. He learned to operate heavy construction equipment, a skilled trade that offered steady work. Bill Thompson wrote him a glowing recommendation, and Jake was hired by a local construction company. "You've earned this chance," Bill said, clapping Jake on the shoulder. "You've fought enough. Now it's time to build." Ethan changed too. He gained 8 kilograms, grew taller, his cheeks healthy and flushed. Coach Mike Turner invited him to join the baseball team, and Ethan played with a passion Jake had never seen before. "Dad, I hit the ball," Ethan shouted after practice, his eyes shining. Jake hugged him, his heart full of pride. "I knew you could do it." The school held an art exhibition. Ethan's painting My Family, showing Dad Jake, Grandpa Frank, Mrs. Martha, Miss Grace, Uncle Sam, and Pastor Henry standing around him, hand in hand, won second prize. When he accepted the award, Ethan told the entire school, "Family isn't about blood. Family is about the people who love you." The whole auditorium rose in applause. Grace suggested a special ceremony. "Let's plant a tree to mark a new beginning." That weekend, the community gathered at the Morrison trailer. Jake, Ethan, and Frank stood at the center. Around them were Grace, Mrs. Martha, Sam Rodriguez, Pastor Henry, Tom Bradley and his family. Coach Mike, Mrs. Dorothy White, Bill Thompson, and Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a young American oak was brought out, a symbol of strength, resilience, and enduring life. Pastor Henry held his Bible, his voice warm. Today we are not just planting a tree, we are planting faith, hope, and love. One by one, everyone took a turn with the shovel. Jake went first, kneeling to place the roots into the earth. "This tree represents our family," he said. "Deep roots, a strong trunk. No matter what storms come, it will stand." Ethan took the next shovel, carefully covering the roots with soil. "And it'll grow with me. Every year I'll get taller, and the tree will too." Frank placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder, his voice trembling with emotion. "3 generations of Morrisons. We are fighters." Mrs. Martha knelt and gently touched the trunk. "You'll see this tree will stand here for 100 years, just like love. It never dies." When the planting was finished, Ethan looked up at his father. "Dad, what should we name the tree?" The community tossed out ideas. Hope tree, family tree, warrior oak. Jake was quiet for a moment, then looked into his son's eyes. Freedom oak. Ethan repeated the name, then asked, "What does it mean, Dad?" Jake knelt to Ethan's level. Freedom from fear. Freedom to be loved. Freedom from a painful past. Freedom to live the life you deserve. Grace brought out a small bronze plaque already engraved. Freedom Oak, planted by the Morrison family, 2024. Below it, in smaller letters, "Where the broken become strong." Pastor Henry offered a prayer, his voice echoing in the peaceful air. The community sang the national anthem, hands over their hearts. Jake watched the flag wave and thought of the comrades he had lost, the sacrifices that made this day possible. Then came the barbecue. The smell of grilled meat filled the air. Laughter rang out. Ethan played ball with the other kids, his laughter clear and bright like silver bells. Jake stood beside Grace, watching his son. "I've come a long way." Grace smiled. "You really have." "Not just me," Jake said, turning to her. "All of us. Me, my son, my father, and you." Grace blushed slightly. "I just did my job." "No," Jake said, taking her hand, gentle but sure. "You gave us hope when I had nothing left. You believed in me when no one else did." They stood there, hand in hand, watching Ethan play. No words were needed. Just being there together was enough. Frank sat with Ethan on the grass, looking at the young oak. "Do you think the tree will grow fast, Grandpa?" "It will grow, but not fast," Frank said wisely. "It needs time, just like you and your dad. A little each year, a little each day." Ethan nodded. "I get it. We're growing too, day by day. Not rushing, but for sure." Frank wrapped an arm around his grandson, his eyes shining with pride. The boy had grown so much, learning lessons many adults never do. As evening fell, people said their goodbyes. Jake, Frank, and Ethan remained by the Freedom Oak. The last light of day filtered through the young leaves, casting golden patterns on the ground. No one spoke. There was only the soft wind in the leaves, distant birdsong, and the calm breathing of 3 generations sitting together. Jake looked at the tree, then at his son, then at his father. 3 Morrison men, each carrying scars, each once broken, now sitting here together, stronger than ever. Not because the pain was gone, but because they had learned to heal together. Ethan leaned his head against his father's shoulder. Jake rested a hand on his son's head. Frank placed a hand on his son's shoulder. 3 generations, 1 set of roots. And the young oak stood there, its roots reaching deep into the earth, its branches stretching toward the sky, a symbol of freedom, of hope, and of a love that would never die. The first winter arrived in Asheville with gentle, chilly winds. 5 months had passed since the Freedom Oak was planted. The tree had made it through autumn, its green leaves still clinging firmly to the branches. Ethan was now 11 years old, taller, broader in the shoulders. He was no longer the thin, cowering child in the shed. Jake had steady work and had managed to buy another used car, not new, but reliable enough to take his son to school and baseball practice. Life was slowly finding its own rhythm, but the past was never truly far away. One afternoon, Grace came to the trailer with an envelope. "Jake, there's a letter from Rebecca. It came through my office." Jake opened it and read the shaky handwritten lines. "Jake, I divorced Derek. I moved to another state and now work at a small cafe. I don't expect Ethan to forgive me. I just want him to know his mother regrets it every single day. I'm sorry for not protecting him. Rebecca, Jake set the letter down and let out a heavy sigh. He called Dr. Sarah Mitchell. "Should I let Ethan read this?" "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," Dr. Mitchell said gently. "Forgiveness means freeing yourself from resentment. The decision belongs to Ethan." Jake decided to give the letter to his son. Ethan sat on his bed, reading his mother's letter. Jake sat beside him, ready to catch him if he broke down. But Ethan didn't cry. He simply read, then folded the letter. "Dad, I don't know how I feel," he said quietly. "I don't hate Mom, but I don't love her anymore either." Jake put an arm around his son's shoulders. "That's okay. You're not required to feel anything. Your feelings belong to you." After a moment, Ethan spoke again. "I want to see her once, not to forgive her, just to say goodbye." Jake looked at his son, an 11-year-old with a maturity far beyond his years. "I'll go with you." 2 weeks later, Jake, Grace, and Ethan drove to the city where Rebecca was living. They met at a small park, with Grace present to supervise. Rebecca stood beneath a large tree, noticeably thinner, her eyes sunken, streaks of grey already in her hair. When she saw Ethan, she stepped forward, her hands trembling. "Ethan," her voice caught. Ethan stood still. He didn't step back, but he didn't move forward either. He looked at the woman who had once been his mother with a calm that was almost unsettling. Rebecca knelt to his level. "I'm sorry. I was a terrible mother." "Yes," Ethan said, his voice steady, neither angry nor forgiving. "You were a terrible mother, but I'm not angry anymore. I'm just sad." Rebecca broke down, trying to pull him into an embrace. Ethan gently stepped back. "Is there anything I can do to make it right?" she asked through tears. Ethan shook his head. "There's nothing you can do. I already have a family. You're not part of it anymore." A painful silence settled over them. The winter wind blew through the park, leaves falling like nature's tears. Ethan took a deep breath. "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I don't want to carry this anger anymore. I want to be free." Rebecca nodded, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak. Ethan turned away, took Jake's hand, and walked off. He didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. Jake glanced at Rebecca one last time. There was no anger left, only emptiness. Then he turned and followed his son. On the drive home, Ethan sat quietly. Then he cried, not loud sobs, but the silent tears of release. Jake pulled the car over and held his son close. "You were very brave." "Dad, did I do the right thing? Should I have forgiven her?" Jake stroked his hair. "You did what you needed to do. Forgiveness doesn't mean going back. It means you're free. You're no longer tied to the past." Ethan nodded and leaned against his father's shoulder. "What about Uncle Derek?" Jake's voice grew firm. "You don't have to forgive Derek. Some people don't deserve forgiveness. Forgiveness is your choice, not an obligation." Dr. Mitchell had told them, "Derek is still facing consequences for his actions. Ethan does not need to see or forgive the person who hurt him." Ethan nodded. "I understand now. I forgave Mom because I wanted to, but I don't have to forgive Uncle Derek." When they got home, the 3 generations of Morrisons went to visit the Freedom Oak. The tree had grown taller, its leaves still green despite the winter cold. Frank rested a hand on the trunk. "This tree is stronger than we thought, just like you." Ethan touched the bark, feeling its rough texture under his palm. "It'll live longer than us, won't it, Grandpa?" "Yes," Frank said proudly, "and everyone who sees it will remember our story. A story about a family that was broken and found its way back. About forgiveness, about love, about freedom." Jake stood behind them, watching his son and his father. He thought about the road they had traveled, from the dark shed to this oak, standing strong, from suffering to healing, from fear to freedom. Ethan turned and smiled at his father. That smile, pure and sincere, said everything. He was free, free from the past, free to live the life he deserved. 2 years passed like pages torn from a calendar. The Freedom Oak now stood 3 meters tall, its broad canopy casting shade over the Morrison family. Jake and Grace were married in a small ceremony at the Baptist church, with Ethan serving as best man. Frank, though his health was failing, smiled radiantly on the day his son found new happiness. Ethan was 12, captain of the baseball team, an honor student. He was no longer a frightened child. He was a confident young man, sure of who he was and what he wanted. On Veterans Day, the town of Asheville held its commemoration at the Morrison home, now expanded into a cozy house. Hundreds attended. Veterans, families, children rescued from difficult circumstances. Ethan stood before the crowd, microphone in hand, his voice steady. 2 years ago, I lived in a shed. I had no hope. I thought my life would always be dark. Then my dad came home. He fought in Afghanistan, and he fought for me. This tree, Freedom Oak, is a symbol. It says it's never too late to heal. If my dad could save me, then anyone can save a child in need. The entire crowd applauded. Many wiped away tears. Jake stepped forward, put an arm around his son, and turned to the crowd. I once thought I had lost my son. I once believed the wounds of war would destroy me. But I learned this: healing is not done by one person. Healing is done by a community. If anyone listening is living in darkness, is afraid, speak up. Someone will hear you. Someone will fight for you. Pastor Henry announced the Plant Your Oak program, planting 100 oak trees across town, each honoring a veteran or a child who had overcome hardship. 100 families planted trees together. Ethan and the baseball team helped. Grace handed out flyers. If you need help, call. 6 months later, Frank sat beneath the Freedom Oak, watching the sunset. Jake found his father asleep, a gentle smile on his face. His light had quietly gone out, making room for the next generation. At the funeral, the entire town came. Ethan read a poem. Grandpa, you are the roots of our family tree. Roots cannot be seen, but they hold the tree upright forever. They laid Frank to rest in the veterans' cemetery and planted a small oak beside his grave, so he would always be part of this forest of freedom. 3 years later, Ethan was 15. The Freedom Oak stood 5 meters tall, its shade wide. He received an art scholarship. Jake and Grace had a young daughter named Hope. Ethan asked Jake to take him back to Rebecca's old house. The new owner allowed them into the backyard. The shed was still there, leaning, close to collapse. Ethan stepped inside and looked around. Dad, I lived here. Looking at it now, it's hard to believe I survived. Jake hugged him. You survived because you're strong, and because you weren't alone. Back home, Ethan sat beneath the Freedom Oak and drew. The painting showed, on the left, the dark shed. On the right, the radiant Freedom Oak. Between them, a boy stepping from darkness into light. Behind him, the silhouette of a soldier guiding him. The title, The Journey Home. The painting was exhibited at the library. Ethan wrote, I once lived in darkness, then my father brought me home. Home is not where you are born. Home is where you are loved. 10 years after Jake found Ethan in the shed, Ethan was 22, a graduate of an art college, returning to hold his first solo exhibition. The Freedom Oak stood 8 meters tall, its trunk thick, its leaves full. Beneath it stood Jake, now 45, Grace, Hope, 7 years old, and a community grown older but still united. Ethan addressed the crowd at the exhibition. 12 years ago, I was a broken child. I didn't know what love was. Then a soldier came home not to save a country, but to save his son. My father taught me this. Strength isn't never breaking. Strength is breaking and standing back up. Now I stand here, not perfect, but free. If you are broken, remember this. Someone will come. Someone will fight for you. And one day, you will plant your own tree. That tree will stand for 100 years, telling your story. At sunset, Jake and Ethan sat beneath the Freedom Oak. Around them, children played, veterans talked, families laughed. In the branches, a bird's nest. On the ground, fallen acorns ready to sprout. No words were spoken, only the wind rustling through the leaves, only the quiet love between father and son. Jake placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan rested his head on his father's shoulder. 2 Morrison men, one who fought to come home, one who learned to trust again, sat beneath the tree they had planted, in the shade of freedom. And the Freedom Oak stood there, roots deep, trunk strong, leaves green, a living testament that it is never too late to come home, never too late to heal, never too late to love. The wind carried the seeds far and wide. The story would continue, love would spread, and hope would never fade. The story you have just followed is a work of fiction, but it is inspired by real events that have happened and continue to happen in everyday life. The names of characters, locations, and certain details have been changed to protect the privacy and safety of those involved. However, the emotions, pain, and journey of healing that Jake and Ethan experience faithfully reflect what many families, many children, and many fathers are quietly facing each day. From this story, we can draw several profound lessons about life. First, never remain silent in the face of harm to children. If you or someone you know is living in an unsafe environment, experiencing neglect or abuse, speak up. There are always people and organizations ready to help, from neighbors, teachers, and doctors to child protection agencies. One small action, one timely phone call, can save an entire life. Second, love and perseverance have extraordinary healing power. Jake shows us that a father does not have to be perfect or wealthy. What matters is not giving up and always staying by a child's side. Sometimes, the greatest miracle is simple presence, quiet, steady, and unwavering, day after day. Third, forgiveness is not about erasing the past, it is about freeing oneself. Ethan teaches us that we have the right to let go of resentment, but we are not obligated to return to places or people that caused us harm. Forgiveness is a personal journey, and it only has meaning when it brings us greater freedom. Finally, hope always exists. No matter how long the darkness lasts, no matter how deep the wounds may be, the light can return. Jake and Ethan found their own freedom oak, not because life became perfect, but because they refused to abandon each other and refused to give up on themselves. If this story touched your heart, please click like to support the channel. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can continue joining us for other moving stories about fatherhood, healing, and people who were once broken but found the strength to stand again. Please share this story with your friends and loved ones. Somewhere out there may be a father who feels helpless, a child who needs to be heard, or a person in despair who needs one reason to keep going. One story shared can become a ray of light for an entire life.